For centuries, an extraordinary war has raged across the world's oceans, above and below the waves.
You could kill hundreds of people with one broadside. These were extremely powerful war machines.
Shipbuilders designed bigger and faster vessels to outwit and crush their opponents.
That nation that has most powerful battleship fleet can destroy the enemy's battleship fleet and therefore control the seas. And if you control the seas, you control the world.
They carried terrifying weapons.
This was going to be the first time that somebody had fired a torpedo in anger since World War II. They needed to get it right.
But ships have also liberated and rescued thousands.
You can think of Gerda 3 as basically a lifeboat for persons hunted by the Nazis.
And inspired men and women to acts of incredible bravery.
I will take you there now, to your cannons, to your death. We will sink before surrender.
These vessels and their crews have shaped world history.
As the commanding officer of a missile-carrying submarine, I was directly responsible for helping to prevent World War III.
This time, the dark side of naval warfare. A world of spies, deception, and trickery. And vessels that were not what they seemed.
He'd get his crew to come out on deck, sure that the ship they were about to inspect was not carrying any guns, and then whoops, sides would drop down, lifeboats would turn into guns, Royal Navy crews would appear from nowhere.
The spy boat that brought Japan into the war.
This must count as the most valuable and unexpected intelligence windfall, possibly of the 20th century.
And the mystery of the death of Britain's most famous soldier.
So the coffin was put in a chapel overnight, and when it was opened, it was found there was no body inside at all.
Warships may look invincible, but they've always been vulnerable in one key area: attack from below. For centuries, they've been attempts to perfect a vessel that could use deception to strike underwater: the submarine. After much trial and error, one man hit upon a design that became the blueprint for all the subs that followed. But his determination to achieve his dream drew him into the 19th century world of violent revolution, political intrigue, and secrets. By the end of the 19th century, Britain had the biggest and most powerful navy in the world. But they had no submarines. One British admiral even went as far as to describe them as underhand and a damned un-English weapon. But as other world powers started to build subs, the Admiralty desperately tried to catch up. They searched for the most technologically advanced submarine design and decided the vessels built by an Irishman named John Philip Holland were by far the best.
John Philip Holland was a sort of natural-born engineer, self-taught. He emigrated to America in 1873. It is said that he emigrated with just one suitcase, and even the suitcase had plans for early submarine designs in it.
In 1900, the Royal Navy bought Holland's designs and built their own version. This is the first submarine commissioned by the Royal Navy, HMS Holland I.
The Holland boats were the first real submarines, primarily because what John Philip Holland's real genius was to combine a number of different technologies, all of which were available in the late 19th century, into a single unit. So the Holland-class boats have a petrol engine to drive them on the surface, which gives them the real ability to travel a fair distance. But that petrol engine can be shut down, and then once they've dived, the submarine can then operate off an electric motor. Now, when the submarine surfaces again, the petrol engine is restarted and the electric motor is turned into a dynamo that recharges the batteries. In the Holland I class, you see basically all the fundamental technology that was to shape submarine design for the next 50 years.
But the Holland boats held a secret. They were funded by an organisation that hated the British government. An organisation prepared to use violence to achieve their aims. The Fenian Brotherhood was an Irish organisation fighting for freedom from British rule. They had plenty of supporters in the United States, one of whom was John Philip Holland's brother, Michael. In 1880, Michael Holland made an audacious proposal. The Fenians should finance the building of a sub that would terrorise the British.
There isn't actually any great deal of evidence that John Philip himself was politically motivated, but as a true and obsessive engineer, he was quite happy to receive finance from wherever he could, and the design of his submarines and their construction was expensive, and the Fenians were prepared to put up the money to develop a weapon which they thought that they could actually deploy against the Royal Navy.
The result was the Fenian Ram. Launched in 1881, the submarine was equipped with a revolutionary dynamite gun that could fire steel projectiles. Early trials were successful, and the Fenians were confident that their experimental sub could soon be used against the hated Royal Navy. But Holland became unhappy with his financiers.
He fell out with the Fenians because they wanted to take control of the submarines and operate themselves, and as a result they ended up sinking at least one of the submarine designs, which they stole from John Philip's yard without telling him.
Holland split with the Brotherhood. He started his own company, perfected his designs, and in 1900 sold a submarine to the US Navy, who christened it the USS Holland. Across the Atlantic, the Royal Navy soon followed their lead, with HMS Holland.
The Holland design was a brilliant design for its time. Had it not been so good, the Royal Navy might have discarded the whole notion of developing submarines. The Holland design really sets the blueprint for the next 50 years.
So the sub that had been designed to defeat the British ended up helping the British. A submarine would play a key role in one of the great mysteries of World War I. 13 years after the launch of the Holland I, Britain was at war with Germany. The country was in desperate need of men willing to fight. This recruiting poster became one of the most famous images of the First World War. Urging men to enlist is the Secretary of State for War, Lord Horatio Herbert Kitchener. By the end of the 19th century, Kitchener made his name as the man who'd conquered the Sudan for the British Empire. His reputation made the poster a powerful recruiting tool. But 2 years later, the great war hero was dead, drowned off the coast of Scotland. His death remains one of the great mysteries of the war. In the spring of 1916, the situation on the Eastern Front was deteriorating. The Russians were short of munitions, and morale in the army was low. With a German victory imminent, the British government decided a confidential, diplomatic mission offering British help was urgently needed. It was to be led by a man greatly respected by the Russians, the 65-year-old war hero, Lord Kitchener. On the 4th of June, he travelled from London to the naval base at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys. There he boarded the cruiser that would take him to Russia, HMS Hampshire.
She was very heavily armoured for her time, 6-inch armour, and cruisers were designed to be long range, basically to operate for the fleet anywhere in the world, all around the Empire. Designed to be fast and take on really anything smaller than a battleship.
German U-boats patrolled the North Sea. So when HMS Hampshire set sail on the 5th of June, she was escorted by 2 destroyers. They were ordered to sail at a fast 18 knots. Ships at that speed were a hard target for U-boat captains. Then, a gale suddenly blew in from the northeast.
So the decision was made, instead of going the normal route, which would have been out to the east of the Northern Isles of Orkney, the decision was taken that Hampshire was going to go out to the west, and therefore would be protected from the northeasterly gales by the big cliffs that run up the west side of Orkney's mainland.
Now, they regularly swept the east coast of Orkney for mines because it was such a regular route. Now, this hadn't been done on the west side.
During the voyage, the wind shifts dramatically and increases to gale force 9, but from the northwest. Because of this, the escort ships with Hampshire had to turn back and Hampshire continued alone.
At 7:40 in the evening, about a mile from land, HMS Hampshire suddenly exploded. The centre of the vessel was ripped apart. She began to sink fast.
So I think for the men that went into the water, they would have been able to see the cliffs. They would have been able to see what would have been their salvation, and I think to perish that close to shore would have been just terrifying.
It's thought that probably about 500 of the crew died within the first hour. Some from the explosion, some from exposure, some of them dragged down as the ship sank.
Only 12 men survived. 737 men died, and those bodies recovered from the sea were buried on Orkney. And what of Lord Kitchener, the man synonymous with the war effort? There were reports that as the ship sank, he was on deck as they struggled to get lifeboats away.
One of the survivors reported that he heard the gunnery officer saying, "Make way for Lord Kitchener." But none of the survivors say they saw Kitchener getting into one of the boats.
The news of Kitchener's death made headlines around the world. The British public found it hard to believe that a man who embodied the British war effort was dead. With the death of such a famous public figurehead, conspiracy theories immediately started to spring up. One rumour claimed Kitchener was alive and living in Russia. Another that a German spy on the Hampshire had signalled to a U-boat to torpedo the ship. One man convinced Kitchener's death was a mystery to be solved was a journalist named Frank Power. The government had remained quiet about the drowning, so Power came up with some theories of his own.
Now, he was stirring the story up in 1925, 1926, mostly to sell his own publications, and the Navy reacted at the time by saying that they saw no need for a public inquiry, that's not how they did things, and that there was no need for further investigation.
The staggering claim by Power was that Kitchener did escape from the Hampshire, but was then shot by a British agent as he made it to shore.
The day after the sinking, soldiers were posted to prevent the public from getting close, not because of any great secrecy, but they did want to keep them away because there were a lot of bodies washing ashore, and not intact bodies at that.
Frank Power persisted with ever more outlandish theories, but one day came unstuck in dramatic fashion. He claimed to have found Kitchener's body, which had been washed ashore in Norway.
And then he brought it all the way down to London, and the intention was that it would be he'd be buried at Westminster Abbey. So the coffin was put in a chapel overnight, but the coroner in Westminster decided that the coffin should be checked, and when it was opened, it was found there was no body inside at all.
In 2014, all the government papers on the loss of HMS Hampshire were finally released. Despite rumours of sabotage, it's now certain that she was sunk by a mine laid by a German U-boat just a week before the sinking. One of Hampshire's propellers has now been brought ashore and stands as an unofficial memorial on Orkney. The sinking was a stark reminder of the deadly threat posed by German U-boats. To defeat them, the Royal Navy turned to a form of trickery that was quite out of the ordinary. The latest innovations in modern art.
To do 2,000 ships, as they did in World War I, with a broom and a bucket, it was an awesome task.
Moored on the River Medway in Kent is a long-retired merchant ship. Her lively paintwork and the shape of her hull tell a story of wartime lies and deceit on a massive scale. This is HMS President. In the First World War, the greatest menace to Allied shipping was the formidable and elusive German U-boat. Merchant vessels were an easy target. The British needed to deploy their own trickery.
The ships themselves were often done out in very proud British colours, but that gave anyone who wanted to attack them a very clear idea of exactly what ship it was. Once it became clear that that was helping U-boats, they had to think about other changes.
Desperate measures were needed, and in 1917, inspiration came not from the world of naval architecture, but from an unlikely source.
An idea came up which is being used by artists, young contemporary artists, Picasso for instance, who were breaking up the lines of paintings and portraits and still lifes in order to show people a different view of what that object looked like. And the concept came about, well, what, if you could do that with paintings, with bowls of fruit, you could do that with a ship so that it would confuse the U-boat captain as to which direction the ship was going, and what speed was it going, and was there one ship or two ships or three ships? Because that was what was necessary for the U-boat captain in order to decide where to fire his torpedo.
The brains behind this extraordinary idea was an artist named Norman Wilkinson. He worked out that you could never completely camouflage a ship because the funnels would always give it away. But you could confuse the enemy by turning your ship into a floating Picasso. The technique became known as Dazzle painting.
Norman Wilkinson threw a great deal of enthusiasm into the idea of Dazzle painting the ships. In fact, he set up a studio in the Royal Academy in Piccadilly where he had 50 or 60 people working on little models of ships and painting them in a way that the models could then be sent to the dockyard where, heaven knows what they thought, but the ship painters will be there with all these bright, brilliant colours painting the ships to these extraordinary shapes.
The technique was unproven and hugely time-consuming, but it was taken up on a massive scale. Merchant ships, warships, and troop ships were all painstakingly repainted in minute detail.
When we decorated this ship with the Dazzle design to help the commemoration of World War I, it took us 6 or 7 days to get the ship covered in the Dazzle paint that we have now. And those were 6 or 7 intensive working days. To do 2,000 ships, as they did in World War I, with a broom and a bucket, it was an awesome task. I suspect the Royal Navy were rather shocked and perhaps appalled by the fact that their ship was suddenly turning, went off to the dockyard and came back looking like a children's playground. But if it meant the ship was going to be safe to operate, then I think the crews were much happier.
HMS President wasn't just disguised. It also had another secret. She and hundreds of other merchant ships were designed to lure U-boats into an ingenious trap, exploiting a weakness of the submarine.
Torpedoes were expensive, and a submarine could only carry a limited number. So the U-boat captain would prefer to approach the cargo ship on the surface to check and see what goods the ship was carrying.
A submarine is at its most vulnerable on the surface. So the British Admiralty created a whole new class of vessel with the codename Queenstown, after the Irish port where they were based. but they were known simply as Q-ships.
It was created so that the U-boat thought it was an unarmed cargo ship, and therefore the U-boat would approach the cargo ship on the surface. It did have the ability to turn very quickly and ram the U-boat.
Q-ships were specifically designed to inflict maximum damage in a collision while staying seaworthy themselves. HMS President was one of the 360 Q-ships built by the Navy.
One of the key things you'll notice about the ship is how close the ribs of the ship were constructed, therefore making the ship an extremely strong vessel altogether. And if you go to the bow of the ship, it's rather beautiful, but you'll see these ribs come closer and closer together so that the actual point of the ship almost looks like an axe. And the reason for that was that the strength of the bow of the ship, reinforced as it was, could take on any U-boat and disable it just by ramming it.
HMS President was built as a ram, but also packed a lethal punch, with 2 4-inch guns and 2 12-pounders to attack submarines on the surface. Some of the guns were ingeniously concealed.
So the U-boat captain would be looking through his periscope. He'd get his crew to come out on deck, having been sure that the ship they were about to inspect was not carrying any guns, and then whoops, sides would drop down, lifeboats would turn into guns, Royal Navy crews would appear from nowhere, and before the U-boat captain could get his crew back into the conning tower, back into the submarine, back, dive, the Q-ship would have hit her and rammed her and disabled the U-boat.
Although the concept of Q-ships was deception and subterfuge, the Admiralty insisted on ships' captains sticking to the rules of engagement.
The meeting of a U-boat and a Q-ship was a little bit of theatre. So before anybody could pull the trigger on any gun or turn the ship to, in actual fact, ram the U-boat, the flags had to be changed. And then men in Royal Navy gear could appear on the decks. So an exciting piece of theatre which would take place, being fatal for either the U-boat or the Q-ship.
One of the 2 vessels was certain not to survive this encounter. The Q-ship confrontations of the First World War showed just how effective disguising a ship could be. 20 years later, a German vessel would achieve an even greater level of deception and make an amazing discovery.
Papers should have been thrown overboard. They weren't. This is world strategic importance, and in due course, those papers ended up in possession of the Japanese Navy in Tokyo.
During the First World War, the British attempted to fool the Germans with their Dazzle paint and Q-ships. With the outbreak of war 20 years later, the Germans had taken note of the idea and began to develop it even further. This is the story of one of the most successful contricks of the Second World War. Germany knew that to win the war, they had to hit the British merchant fleet, but their navy lacked resources. 3 pocket battleships weren't enough. They came up with an ingenious idea that involved converting existing ships into something much more menacing.
If you add a number of merchant ship conversions which went out into the sea lanes in disguise, more or less equipped as Q-ships with guns and things behind false bulkheads and so on, then they too could act as merchant raiders and disrupt the passage of merchant ships around the world.
One of the ships they converted was a cargo ship called the Golden Fells, a feat of naval engineering and disguise that used her best attributes to her advantage. She was renamed Atlantis.
She was quite a big merchant ship for her day, and she had a range of about 60,000 miles, which was just astonishing. And not really until nuclear propulsion could warships match that.
The idea was a simple one. Atlantis would use her enormous range to hunt merchant ships and capture or sink them. She would have the elements of surprise, because her firepower would be cleverly concealed.
Her weapons would be hidden behind hinged bulkheads which could drop down, revealing guns already loaded and waiting to open fire.
If stopped by a British warship, she would be hard to identify as an enemy vessel.
Atlantis had to become expert at disguises, so she'd have ways of altering her profile, and she could claim to belong to various different nations. And she was really buying time, and maybe if darkness arrived fairly soon, she could slip away before the British cruiser got the answer back from the Admiralty as to whether that was a genuine identity or not. Atlantis would be able to alter the shape of her funnel. She would have false masts, or maybe change the height of her masts. She could change her paint scheme, and she could put up canvas screens to look like bulkheads or structures on board.
In March 1940, under the command of Captain Bernhard Roger, she sailed from Germany, remarkably undergoing a number of disguises along the way. Initially, she was a neutral Soviet vessel called the Kim. As she headed for the shipping lanes of the South Atlantic, the Kim miraculously transformed into a Japanese vessel called the Kasi Maru. Her first victim was a British cargo ship called Scientist, sunk off the coast of Africa. Atlantis then sailed east, pretending to be a Dutch ship called the Abbeykerk. By November 1940, Atlantis had sunk 11 vessels. Where possible, Captain Roger rescued their crews and transferred them to other ships. He looked after his own men well, sharing out captured goods such as beer and sweets. The Atlantis was spreading fear. British merchant vessels were lengthening their voyages just to avoid her. The Royal Navy sent 4 warships to track down this audacious raider. Then, on the 11th of November, the Atlantis came across a British cargo passenger liner called the Automaton. The confrontation would reveal a secret highly advantageous for the Germans and their allies.
And when she's really quite close, up goes the German flag, down go all the fake bulkheads, and she starts revealing her guns and starts firing a couple of warning shots. And does an awful lot of damage to her superstructure and upper works, killing several men.
A boarding party crossed to the Automaton. The expectation was that they'd discover weapons, ammunition, or even riches. But what they found was food supplies and bags of mail.
In the ship's chart house, they found a green bag full of some documents, and they just grabbed them along with everything else, but no indication that this was anything out of the ordinary except another successful interception and destruction of an Allied merchant ship.
Captain Roger could read English and knew exactly the significance of the papers.
On board Automaton were some War Cabinet minutes which contained a completely blunt appraisal of how vulnerable Britain had become in the Far East. The papers should have been thrown overboard. They weren't.
The officer whose job it was to protect the documents had been killed. Britain's military weakness was invaluable information to Germany's ally Japan, keen to expand their empire and take on British and American territories.
This must count as the most valuable and unexpected intelligence windfall, possibly of the 20th century. This is world strategic importance, and in due course, those papers ended up in possession of the Japanese Navy in Tokyo.
They concluded that if they attacked an American base, Britain couldn't help them. The following year, They chose Pearl Harbor. Atlantis carried on her remarkable secret mission for 12 more months. Until on the 22nd of November, she rendezvoused with a U-boat north of Ascension Island in the South Atlantic. She was spotted by the British heavy cruiser HMS Devonshire. The warship signaled to the merchant vessel to identify herself.
Devonshire isn't fooled by the reply Atlantis gives, and she has the sense to keep away out of the range of any possible guns that this strange ship might have. And in the end, she engaged Atlantis with her 8-inch guns. And that is the end of Atlantis.
Captain Roger was the last to abandon ship. He and most of the crew were rescued by the U-boat. During her 602-day voyage, Atlantis achieved some remarkable results in her various guises. Not only were 22 ships sunk, she even managed to effectively change the course of the war. 5 years later, the world was very different. Germany and Japan were in full retreat. Both sides were still hoping secret technology could bring victory. Strange craft were being invented to smuggle spies, and new weapons produced in an attempt to secure victory at sea.
It was an acoustic torpedo, so it would listen out for its target. This was cutting-edge technology at the end of World War II.
In 1986, a Danish wreck hunter made an amazing discovery at the bottom of the Kattegat Sea between Denmark and Sweden. It was a German U-boat that was rumored to be full of Nazi gold. It wasn't until August 1993 that the ship was finally able to be raised to the surface. Its name? U-534.
She's a Type 9C-40 U-boat, so she was an ocean-going type. She could travel in excess of 13,000 nautical miles, stay away at sea for 3 months.
The salvage sub was one of over 1,000 built by the German Navy to win the Battle of the Atlantic. U-534 was well armed for the fight.
She was equipped for being on the offensive by having 6 torpedo tubes. She had 4 torpedo tubes forward and 2 aft, and she could fire different types of torpedo as well as laying mines.
Submarines were vulnerable from attack from surface vessels armed with sonar listening equipment. But U-534 had an ingenious decoy to deal with sonar.
U-boats were sometimes equipped with a device called the Pillenwerfer or pill thrower, which is where the rectangular opening is there. That would have originally had a plate over it with just a small aperture. From inside the U-boat, they could fire out a canister of a chemical which would react with seawater, and that would fizz very loudly, which would really disrupt the sonar on any Allied ships.
Despite bristling with firepower and the latest equipment, U-534 was not intended as an attack submarine. It had a little-known but crucial role in the Battle of the Atlantic.
She was used for training and for weapons testing, and an important role that she was used for on one of her biggest patrols was actually weather forecasting and weather reporting out in the North Atlantic. It was very important for the war effort to know what weather was coming across to Europe.
By 1945, the Allies had the upper hand. They had warships equipped with sophisticated depth charges and short-wave radar sets. The U-boat crews were on the run.
Chances of survival were fairly poor, actually. In the early days of the war, when they were being very successful, reasonably good. But as we got better and better at sinking them, the chances started to really diminish. So you're talking about 40,000 men were trained to work on U-boats during World War II, and about 30,000 of them were killed. It's a 75% mortality rate. It was really harsh.
U-534 should have had a good chance to survive the war. By May 1945, Germany was close to surrender. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. And on May the 5th, the German Navy ordered all submarines, including U-534, to surrender. But her crew had other ideas. Though due to surrender by 8 AM that day, U-534 was spotted hours later by RAF Liberator bombers off the coast of Denmark.
She made no attempt to surrender, and in fact she opened fire on them, succeeding in shooting one of them down. One of the Liberator bombers succeeded in dropping a depth charge which landed up on the deck behind us. It rolled off, detonated, causing the damage that we can see here. So clearly we can see the damage to the outer hull. It's just the thin plating there, but inside is the pressure hull. That pressure hull was completely ruptured. There is a large split in it, and it let in seawater. It was unrecoverable, so the order was given to abandon ship.
47 men escaped in rafts, but 5 went down with the boat, trapped in the torpedo room. After the sub hit the seabed 200 feet down, they began to escape.
Once the forward torpedo room flooded, they were able to open the torpedo loading hatch and surface. Sadly, one of those guys passed away, having held his breath as he surfaced, and that caused terrible lung damage. We think the other 2 died from exposure.
2 men managed to escape and survive. It was a miracle that only 3 men from U-534 died. But why did the captain put their lives at risk? Why did U-534 refuse to surrender? For years after the war, there was intense speculation that she was carrying Nazi gold. This led to the salvage operation in 1993. Brought up with the sub were crew records and documents, even a legendary Enigma cipher machine. But there was no Nazi gold. There was, however, an amazing find, a secret revolutionary torpedo called the T-11.
This was cutting-edge technology at the end of World War II. It was an acoustic torpedo, so it would listen out for its target. Here at the nose is where all the listening equipment and tech was, leading on to the warhead. This warhead, 440 pounds of hexanite high explosive.
Acoustic torpedoes struck by homing in on the shock waves created by a ship's propeller as it churned up the sea. However, the Allies had neutralized its threat by designing a decoy known as a Foxer, a device towed behind a ship simulating the noise of a propeller.
This version, the T-11, was actually intelligent, and it could tell the difference. Rather than just listen out for the loudest sound, it would pick out the actual ship's propeller rather than the Foxer device.
Potentially, this torpedo and its ability to wreak havoc on enemy ships could be the reason why U-534's captain refused to give up his sub. One theory is that he was trying to get it to Japan, Germany's ally, still fighting on in the Pacific.
She might have been smuggling this latest weapons technology off to their allies in Japan. She had the range to get there, she was fully fueled up, full of food, and quite easily could have done that journey.
But if U-534 had got the acoustic torpedoes to Japan, it may well have been too late to alter the course of the war. But it wasn't just the Germans. The US had surprises of their own. They were getting ready for a massive invasion to crush its enemy. A secret experimental vessel was a key part of the plan. In amongst the glamorous World War II patrol boats, in the Battleship Cove Museum in Massachusetts, is an odd-looking wooden craft. When the museum acquired it in the 1970s, they believed it was a Japanese kamikaze boat, built for suicide missions against Allied warships. Then in 2011, classified CIA documents were released that revealed it was nothing of the kind. The boat was not Japanese, but in fact, American. It was a semi-submersible, developed and built by the forerunner of the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS.
It was designed to run shallow in the water, just enough for the glass cupola and the stacks to be above the water. Only 2 of these vessels were built.
The men who developed this secret craft nicknamed it Gizmo. Gizmo was built for the Pacific War version of D-Day, an amphibious invasion of Japan called Operation Olympic. X-Day, as it was known, would be the 1st of November 1945. Supported by waves of bombers, over 42 aircraft carriers and 400 destroyers would be involved in the landings. Intelligence on military bases near the invasion beaches was essential. Japanese-speaking Korean spies were key to Operation Olympic's success. Korea had been under Japanese control since 1905, and there were plenty of recruits keen to turn against their occupiers.
The idea was these 2 vessels were going to be operated by 1 OSS agent piloting it and 2 Korean operatives inside the vessel. They would be transported in on a submarine. They would sneak in at night using a compass with no light, navigate into the beach of Japan, drop off 2 Korean operatives, return to the submarine, pick up 2 more Korean operatives, and make the trip one more time, a 7-hour trip with 3 men in this very small vessel. The steering mechanism is actually very much like a similar like go-kart, just a small handle you'd push back and forth for the rudder.
The Gizmos were tested at night without permission outside the Los Angeles naval base. If discovered, they would be treated as enemy vessels.
The idea was to sneak into the naval base undetected. Even the naval base was not aware that they were sneaking in to make the challenge more realistic.
The Gizmos succeeded every time, thanks to their ingenious design.
The low profile, just running just above the water, was one way to avoid the radar. The stacks above the waterline were actually wrapped with steel wool to also deflect the radar signals.
But X-Day, an Operation Olympic, would never come to fruition. The Gizmo teams would never make it beyond American waters. Unknown to any of them, a parallel strategy to end the war was being developed. On August 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Japan surrendered 9 days later. The secret Gizmo project was cancelled. But 60 years of intrigue, spying, and deception wasn't over. It had become part and parcel of modern warfare. The end of the Second World War meant that all that creativity and ingenuity would now be directed at a new enemy, the Soviet Union. The secrets and lies continued.